Amy, one of the ways that I can think about my life is in terms of playgrounds. Because when I was little, I remember going to the playground at the elementary school in this little town where we lived and climbing around on the jungle gym and all that. And I went back up there this year, almost 40 years later, and it looked totally different. But it was also different when my kids were in elementary school, and they loved going to the playground at the park. But everything that was there and the whole setup looked a lot different from when I was a kid. And then when we moved to Guatemala, things were really different there. Things like, nails and screws and none of that really, chipping paint, none of that really seemed to matter, rust, broken bottles, kids just sort of played, and if something happened, it happened. Right. It's funny to think about it in terms of that. We just forget because we're not there to see the changes happen a little bit over time. It's like, you leave a playground and you don't go back for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Consumer Product Safety Commission reports that each year, more than 200,000 children ages 14 and younger go to hospital emergency departments in the U.S. with injuries associated with playground equipment.
And that's a lot of playgrounds. And you just mentioned a few. And I would imagine that would be pretty tricky, when you think about what happens across other countries as well. And I guess when I think about children playing on the playground, I know my kiddos have many injuries at playgrounds, but I'm also thinking about myself. I've just picked up pickleball. And so, I'm laughing at times when I'm running for something in my weekend warrior mentality, thinking that I'm, going to get that ball and then later on having to take Advil and ice that ankle. And you know what, Holland, did you realize that biking injuries among adults was the most common in 2020?
I hadn't, although I'm sure that makes sense based on what people were doing in 2020 because they couldn't be in groups unless it was outside. So
Exactly. So, with the increased need for safety around leisure and sports, this is a good conversation. It's good timing.
And to talk about it, we have at the Afterword table, Giovani Garbutt, President and Program Director for American First Responder. Welcome.
Hi, how are you guys doing today?
And also helping us dive a little bit deeper, we have Dr. Jill Sturts, Associate Professor at Virginia Wesleyan Department of Sports and Recreation, and also the Assistant Dean at Batten Honors College. So Jill, we're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
All right. Well, both of you have personal stories of something led you into this. So in just 60 seconds, would you mind sharing the Cliff Notes version of who you are and why you do what you do?
Jill, you go first.
Certainly. First of all, thanks for having me. Cliff Notes version. I am a former practitioner in campus recreational sport. So I worked in college campuses, specifically implementing programs in campus recreation. And when I was at Ashland University in Ohio, I had an opportunity to teach an introductory course. It was called Introduction to Sport Sciences. And when I was doing that, I realized that I had a passion for being in the classroom with students and exposing them to the field of recreation, sport, and leisure, and then also educating them about potential career opportunities, which students aren't often aware of before they get to college, and sometimes still even in college are not. So I pursued a PhD full-time and really got entrenched in the research aspect of the field. And then that was at Indiana University. And then in 2015, I was on the search for a tenure track position, and I landed here at Virginia Wesleyan University. It was the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies initially. And we revamped our curriculum a little bit a few years ago to implement the sport aspect, which is in alignment with some of my expertise.
That's awesome. Wow, fantastic. How about you, Giovani?
I've been an EMT now for almost 22 years, emergency medical technician. I started off as a combat medic with the United States Marine Corps, United States Navy. Seen a lot of injuries there, quite a few as a combat medic. Did that for a while, that's 5 years. Then came out of the service and just started being a civilian EMT. During that time, I started a company called American First Responder. We teach anything from advanced cardio life support, international trauma life support, to CPR and first aid, as well as my company does staffing events for emergencies, including Pop Warner football. And we take care of Pop Warner kids when they get hurt. We've been doing that now for 10 seasons. I also have a contract with LUSD, and we take care of their high school football players in case they get hurt as well. I have staff that takes care of all EMT staff that really enjoy doing it, to be honest with you, because these kids play with their hearts, and if they do get hurt, we're there to make sure that it's not a serious, it doesn't worsen, or if it's very serious, they're going to cardiac arrest, then we're there to help. So I guess that's a nutshell about me. And I share an affinity of actually teaching. Jill said that she enjoys teaching. I love teaching as well, especially when you get that chance to help them learn how to save a life. It really does inspire other people.
That's great. We have two people on the show, Holland, that are very passionate about what they do. And I love this. This is going to be a great conversation.
For sure.
But Holland and I are not experts. We are not coming from the world of sports medicine. We are not coming from the world of EMTs. Although, Giovani, you've got to tell me, I would imagine there have been times when you have wanted to put that siren on the top of your car and run through traffic just because people were in your way.
If I could, I would every day. Okay. I would do it all the time.
There we go. All right. So let's get a few terms under our belt because, you know, our listeners are varied. We've got lots of different backgrounds on our show. And so we're going to do quick fire round. Doesn't matter who takes the word first or the phrase. And so just to kind of help us level the playing field, what do we mean by first aid? What is that?
If I could take this one.
Sure.
First aid is the first care that you give someone that's ill, sick, or injured. So it's immediate action or care by those bystanders that are around that may be able to just do a quick assessment and treat if necessary. Treat with either helping them with bleeding control or bandaging or quick assessment of medical injuries, medical emergencies, including heart attacks, strokes, anything like that. That's the immediate care that we give someone as far as what we mean by first aid.
Okay. Jill, got anything else to add to that?
I don't. I was hoping that Giovani would tackle these first few because he certainly has the expertise in this area.
Okay. All right. How about protective equipment? What are we talking about?
Now, when we say protective equipment, that is essentially protecting us. Your first aid kit should come with some level of protective equipment, whether that be, I know it's been controversial, a mask, but it should contain at least a mask to protect yourself, gloves, goggles, or anything that would be able necessary to protect yourself. And I'm not just talking about gloves or anything like that, but we can get other things from other people. Again, I'm talking about COVID. I'm talking about like hepatitis, HIV. There are other things that we can get from other people. So in any first aid kit, and especially parents should have a good first aid kit that comes with these items. Again, gloves to protect yourself. And again, any protective equipment that would protect you in that same emergency. Okay.
What about you, Jill? Because I'm thinking of a different type of protective equipment when it comes to playing sports.
Yes. So I was thinking the same way, Amy. I love how our perspectives are all so different.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, protective equipment would be making sure that you have all the things you need to keep yourself safe when you are engaging in any kind of sport or leisure activity. Okay. So, for example, we know that in 2020, right, not only were there bike accidents, but a surge in people riding bikes. Are they wearing helmets? Are they, right? Is their bike well maintained, right? So when we think of protective equipment in my mind related to sport and leisure, it is these items that we have to keep us safe while we're engaging.
Okay. That makes perfect sense. I'm reminded, and I'm not sure if you all remember when rollerblades first came out. It was the hot ticket item.
Right.
I had a friend who was an emergency room nurse, and she was furious because all these kiddos were coming in with broken wrists. She says it only takes 2 pounds of pressure to break a wrist bone. Get your children wrist guards because that will save them when they fall. And I'm like, protective equipment makes sense. Make everybody's life a little bit easier. All right. Okay. How about this one? Risk assessment. Giovani, you talked about assessment when you were talking about first aid. What do you think?
Jill, do you want to start off with this one just so that I get an idea?
Sure. So from my perspective, right, I teach a programming and event planning course. And when we talk about risk assessment, it is identifying hazards, right? So whether they are natural hazards or infrastructure hazards, right? So kind of assessing what types of hazards exist, and then also assessing what type of risks, right? What could happen and how are we going to prepare for that? And I also encourage students to think about 2 different things. That's frequency and severity. And Giovani, this is where I think your expertise really comes in, right? Because sometimes if something is, the most severe occurrence in my mind would be death, right?
Correct.
But in a lot of the things that we're talking about in sport and recreation, the frequency is very minimal. But because it's so severe, you've got to make sure people are trained, prepared, et cetera, right? So when we think about risk assessment, it is, essentially what can go wrong and what are we going to do about it if and when it does. That's just kind of a big picture idea of that.
Yeah.
I agree, especially when we're talking about injuries. If in case something does happen, we want to be able to take a quick look around and just gauge that scene to see if there's any risks to us or preventative measures. If my kids were on a field, not only just football field, I'm talking about my personal kids. If I'm at the playground with them, I'm going to still take a look around to make sure that, hey, are there guards on that equipment? Are there things that are there to protect them? Now, just so happenstance that I'm an EMT and my wife's a nurse, so I think we're pretty safe with us. But sometimes you're at that park and you're like, wow, you take a look around, the kids dropping left and right, and you're like, wow, where are their parents? They need to maybe do that risk assessment themselves.
There you go. That's excellent. Good points. I didn't think about the frequency and severity, but that's true. I mean, it only takes one severe accident to make it concerning. Yeah, good point. Okay, what is an emergency action plan? I think you're kind of leading into it a little bit, Jill, when you were talking about this.
Yeah, so this is essentially after you do the risk assessment and you identify what the risks are, then you create an action plan and then train your staff accordingly.
Okay. Wow, I bet this is where you come in a lot with your staff, Giovani.
Yes. Well, number one, we are instructors that teach for those specific emergencies. We train others on how to do CPR and first aid, but also, like when I go on and teach companies, I encourage them to have that emergency action plan. Now, that's at a place of employment, but oftentimes as parents or just ordinary civilians, we don't take that into perspective to create an emergency action plan for ourselves. So if something does happen, if you're out doing sport and recreation, well, just, you may want to create that emergency action plan for yourself as well. If in case I get hurt and I do need first aid, what's my first action that I should do?
Well, I am so glad that you all are bringing this up because this is what our listeners want to know about and why we're talking about safety with sports and leisure, because a lot of us just don't even think about these things. This is awesome. Okay, last term, we think we know what this is. What is leisure?
I'm happy to tackle this one. So leisure, believe it or not, has been studied very intensely by some pretty prominent leisure scholars, but I will summarize it. So number one, oftentimes leisure is defined by time, right? So unobligated time we're not working or fulfilling obligations. So some scholars kind of reinforce this idea that leisure is defined by unobligated time. And then others will say that leisure is a state of mind. So it is more of a subjective experience that is, that can then really be anything, right? That it's this individual experience that can be, defined by self-expression, etc.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating, because when I was in college as a special education teacher, that was one of my courses, was to help promote leisure activities for those with special needs.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is part of education.
Yes.
And breaking tasks down, task management, those skills, right? To break it down. So this is fascinating to think about it in those two different definitions.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, so in my field, right, we break down these definitions between leisure, recreation, and play, because they're really all three different things.
All right. Well, tell me then, what would be the difference between recreation and play?
Sure. So the difference between recreation and play is recreation is activity-based.
Okay.
Where play is this really innate, spontaneous experience, right? So we infants, right, they innately experience play as they develop.
Yeah.
And recreation is more structured and activity-based.
Okay. Oh, I'm so glad we dug into that a little bit more. That is so helpful. Giovani, anything to add to this one?
No, I think she summed it up very, very well.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. This is very, very helpful.
These are really good answers. I mean, I'm excited about the conversation. All right, let's start with some fundamental, maybe what is the most fundamental question that we want to explore, and that's, how does infrastructure impact sports and leisure activities? What are some of the trends you see in providing safe and equitable places for play?
I'll be happy to start with a couple of ideas. So, Holland, when you opened up the conversation and you were talking about the playground, I think when we think about infrastructure, gosh, playground is one of the first things that kind of comes to mind in terms of evolution, right? And where we've come from. And I think that also has to do with even the certifications, right? So a CPSI, a Certified Playground Safety Inspector, right? These certifications that exist now for the purpose of providing safe places for play. And in my mind, parks and recreation departments are, one of the most prominent places where we see this equity piece come in, right? Because the mission of parks and recreation departments is to provide access for all, right? So we're all essentially paying taxes, whatever community it is for this parks and recreation department, they, get some of our tax money and then provide opportunities. And their mission is to be as equitable as they can with what they're providing.
That's interesting. Every time you were talking about Parks and Rec Department, I wonder if that TV show helped elevate that, municipality kind of little municipality organization in the public consciousness.
Yes, quite possible. Certainly, quite possible. But I think, so in my mind, while parks and recreation, departments are one of these pieces that, help us when it comes to providing services for all, there's even differences in those, right? And there's some small towns even have one.
Right.
So there's that. I think just to add a couple things, and then I'll let Giovani jump in with his thoughts, but I think also one of in terms of equitable spaces, one of the advantages of the pandemic is that we learned how we can flip programming and provide virtual programming, right? And I think we can, consider that maybe there are some things that aren't available to all if they don't have internet access or things like that. But certainly with regard to making some services free that we then no longer have to pay for, right? We're seeing them available online now at maybe no charge. So seeing some of that. So I think that's a trend. I'll let Giovani jump in with maybe some of his ideas.
From my perspective, I guess it's a little bit different as far as infrastructure. What we see, we are the aft end of when something goes wrong as an EMT. So we see the aftermath when injuries do occur. So I think Jill brought up some very good points about having some of that infrastructure there. Again, my personal experience, I do have 2 young kids now, a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. And you were talking about earlier taking your kids there. I do see that there has been changes to those infrastructure, those playgrounds. We're in Los Angeles, so I do see all the parks have that rubber matting now, as opposed to, the hard cement that I grew up on. And I see that changing, especially in many of the parks within Los Angeles County. Now, my other experience with a lot of infrastructure, a lot of these kids that when we have football practice now, we encourage them, to make sure that their pads are well-fitting, their helmet is well-fitting to prevent concussions, and to prevent the buildup of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We really take concussions now very seriously. So there's a dynamic of infrastructure, but there's also the dynamic bringing back that protective equipment, especially in teaching these kids how to wear PPE early, so that they can actually, when they get older, they actually know how to properly fit it, wear it, and prevent injuries as a whole.
Wow, that's an interesting trend for sure, Giovani, because, way back when leatherheads were wearing leather helmets or no helmets on those heads, so we do know that concussion education is vital right now. So that is a very important trend. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mentioned a little bit of many folks participate in leisure activities, weekend sports, may have not been trained. And as you said, Giovani, they may not wear the proper gear to participate in a sport safely. So what are some of the tips? And you've mentioned a few of them, Giovani, and Jill, you did too. Or some strategic recommendations you would want folks to consider before participation. And I'm thinking, now that you've given us a great definition, Jill, this would be more of some of those recreation activities. What would you want people to do before they start jumping in? What do you think, Giovani?
Well, I think most of all, I like that term, risk assessment. You got to do your own risk assessment on yourself, number one, to see what kind of activities you can do. I see the injuries on the aft end. Maybe we show up at the park, my ambulance shows up at the park, and they're already injured, and they may be not prepared to do that jump or that exercise or have exercise or play. So just learning, stretching, learning yourself and doing a risk assessment on yourself and maybe your family too.
Oh, that's a great thing. Excellent. What about you, Jill?
Yes, I was going to say something similar. It is so important to do research ahead of time, right? So determining what type of gear you will need, where it can be found, but having said that, there's a degree of privilege that comes with our ability to just look up what we need. And maybe we're not going to purchase it, but maybe we know a friend that we can borrow from before we're going to purchase. And then we go purchase, right? But this isn't often the case for folks who just decide to do something and don't do all of the prep work first, right? But so having said that, my advice would be do the research ahead of time, find out what would be needed, kind of evaluate your own physical abilities and challenges and prepare accordingly.
Okay. Jill, that's just what you just said. And Giovani, about doing your own risk assessment. Something just came up to me. My daughter and I were talking about this. She was going on a hike at a state park here in North Carolina, and there was a ranger doing kind of like a public service announcement. If you decide to do this, you better have this much water, these kind of shoes, and kind of helping that person. So is part of your job to help people in participation, whether it's Parks or Rec or in a football game, educate, as you are both educators, those who might want to participate? How do you do that?
For us, our standpoint, I think since we do training every day, we encourage people to, number one, take a CPR first aid class, just for your own personal knowledge, just to be prepared in case something does happen. Now, that's of course what we encourage. And as an educator, even when I'm doing, or I'm on my ambulance, or I'm working, or I'm doing standby, I do educate not only the students how to protect themselves, how to treat themselves after the injury has occurred, and what to do next, but I also talk to the parents. I tell the parents, especially after a concussion, or I've evaluated them for concussion, I speak to the parent, let them know, hey, you may want to make sure that you follow up the physician or doctor, or seek treatment if they become lethargic, or if they're not feeling overall well, begin to vomit. There's certain things that you want to do, and you want to make sure that you encourage your parents or the students that we train to, again, be prepared again.
Awesome. What do you think, Jill?
So from my perspective in the classroom, I am teaching the people who are going to be running these programs as their career, right? So these are things that we're talking about. How can you educate people, right? When folks sign up for a program or an event, how can you quickly get them information about what it is that they're going to be doing and how they can be best prepared? Or when people enter a facility, a recreational facility, a workout facility, what types of things can you do to educate them, right? Not only signage, but email blasts, text messages, right? So we identify all the different ways that we can help people be as prepared as possible for whatever it is that they're doing. So those are things that we kind of talk about in the classroom in terms of.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, you don't think about so many nuances.
Yes.
That's important.
Yes. One thing that I thought about too was for folks to consider who they're participating with. That's also really important, right? So is it maybe someone that is of similar like age, ability, etc.? Or are you helping someone, or are you with someone who is maybe a little bit more skilled? This certainly depends on what it is that you're doing. But considering who you're participating with, and also challenge and the level of challenge and skill level is really important too.
Excellent points. Thank you.
We talked earlier about concussions, and I kind of want to go back to the brain for just a minute if we could. Amy and I have talked with some folks before, and we've interviewed people about a mental health crisis that seems to have kind of emerged globally. And research has shown that some outcomes of participating in leisure sports are lowered stress and increased productivity. It seems like a good antidote in some ways to anxiety and depression and some other mental health crises. So while the benefits are clear around sports and leisure and recreation, so is the reluctance to add this tool to daily activity. I mean, some people just say, play or leisure, that, I don't waste time. What are some of your observations about the mental health benefits of leisure activities and how we can respond to folks who feel like leisure or play is a waste of time?
Jill?
I think one of the benefits of the pandemic is some of those folks that thought it was a waste of time, they've come to see the light.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that, from my perspective, gosh, what we saw in the pandemic is that people really did start to see the benefits of movement, the benefits of getting outside, the benefits of social interaction, and then the opposite, right? So if they weren't doing those things, right, let's say, starting March 13th, they were totally shut in. They saw what happened as a result of that, and then maybe hopefully tried to make some adjustments and then saw the benefits, right? So we saw both. We saw advantages, and we're still, as you said, we're having a global mental health crisis, I think, as a result of many of those things. Anyway, to answer your question, I think that we have to continue to take it to people, right? There used to be this idea, if we build it, they will come. That is not our society anymore, right? We have to put things in people's hands or on their phone or in their inbox, and do everything we can to get them to participate, even in a small level or an individual level. But I think people have to feel it and have to experience it. I think reading the research only does so much, right? As we know. But I think that we are slowly but surely getting there. And I think that tons of folks are looking at providing tools to get people more involved, providing opportunities for underserved populations, et cetera, right? So I think the work is being done in many ways.
What would you add to that, Giovani?
Well, I agree, especially throughout this time. We've seen what the pandemic has done to many people mentally. Now, even with us, we encourage you to take a mental first aid class. And part of that mental first aid class is getting out and actually providing some type of exercise, some type of leisure play. It is free from the American Red Cross, and I encourage everyone to actually take that mental first aid class. It is on their website in American Red Cross, and it's a free 1 hour class or so, but it just encourages you, again, to actually take a break and actually consume some time for yourself to, again, de-stress. And part of that de-stressing is that leisure play. I 1000% agree with that.
What a great resource, Holland.
Yes, that's so interesting. I love the name and I love the idea.
Well, we will have to link that in our show notes for sure, because that's a huge benefit. All right. We have a lot more to talk about, but we're going to wrap up this first part of our conversation with an essential element. So, Jill, what do you think is an essential element we need to understand the stories about safety and equity in leisure and sports? What's an essential element? Wrap this up with a pretty bow.
From my perspective, and this is much different than Giovani's, because my perspective isn't necessarily safety, but I think that when we address equity, we have to examine privilege and identify ways in which we can reach people who are not privileged.
Okay.
How can we be fair and equal across the board in terms of access to leisure and recreation?
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, Giovani, let's see what you got. What's an essential element?
From my perspective, again, it's always to be prepared for any type of injuries or any type of condition that you may have that may come up. Being prepared for me, and I come from the emergency background. To me, just having people trained and prepared makes our job a lot easier out there, especially when you don't have to go to the ER for every single thing, but you can patch up people and help yourself. And just knowing the basics and getting trained out there. I like what Jill said about having the disparities that we may see, because even I train a lot of high schools in the South LA area, and they don't get that training. They don't get that exposure. The class that I did today was a free class for students just to prepare them in case something does happen. A lot of these other schools in maybe the Beverly Hills end of it, they may actually have the funding to get an instructor like myself to come out there. But I do it for free sometimes. I enjoy doing it.
Okay. That's awesome. Wow. We're gonna unpack that discussion a little bit more on our next episode. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Special thanks to Dr. Jill Sturts and Giovani Garbutt. We really are grateful for your participation in this conversation. And folks, while you wait for part 2, please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. You can leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends about us. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.